The year is 1763. Deep inside the Habsburg palace, Emperor Joseph II stands alone. His beloved wife, Isabella of Parma, is dead, taken by smallpox. Broken by grief, Joseph unlocks her private writing desk, desperate for a final connection, a diary, a prayer, perhaps a love letter addressed to him. What he finds destroys him. Inside are bundles of letters, frantic and passionate, but they are not for him. They are addressed to his own sister, Maria Christina. As Joseph reads, his world collapses. Isabella writes of a burning, obsessive love for his sister, while describing Joseph not as a husband, but as a repulsive obstacle. In one terrible moment, the emperor realizes his perfect marriage was a sham. He fell in love with a mask, and the betrayal goes deeper than he could have ever imagined. To understand how this disaster happened, we must travel back to where it all began, Parma, Italy. Isabella was born into the House of Bourbon-Parma. It sounds prestigious. It was. But in the 18th century, royal blood was often poison. The Bourbons were known for two things: immense power and a deep hereditary strain of melancholy. Isabella inherited both. She was born in 1741, the daughter of Infante Philip of Spain and Louise Elizabeth of France. Her grandfather was Louis XV. She was royalty squared. But her childhood was not a fairy tale. It was a study in isolation. Parma was a political pawn, a small duchy caught between the giant powers of Europe. Isabella's parents did not marry for love. They married to seal a treaty. Her mother, Louise Elizabeth, was the eldest daughter of Louis XV. She was cold, ambitious, and deeply unhappy in her marriage to Philip. She hated Parma. She missed Versailles. She looked at her daughter not as a child to be nurtured, but as an asset to be managed. Isabella learned her first lesson early. Love is transactional. People are only valuable as long as they are useful. Isabella was a brilliant child. She absorbed information like a sponge. She learned Italian, French, Spanish, and Latin. She studied history and philosophy. She played the violin with a skill that shocked her tutors, but her intelligence was a double-edged sword. It allowed her to see the world clearly, and she did not like what she saw. She saw the hypocrisy of the court. She saw the trapped lives of the women around her. She saw her mother's bitterness. Then, the first tragedy struck. Her mother died. Louise Elizabeth passed away while visiting Versailles. Isabella was 18. For most young women, the loss of a mother is a heartbreak. For Isabella, it was a confirmation. It confirmed her growing belief that life is nothing but a series of losses leading to the grave. She did not grieve in the normal way. She did not scream. She went quiet. She retreated into books. She began to read the philosophers of the Enlightenment, but she gravitated toward the darker works. She became obsessed with the concept of mortality. She started to write. Her early writings from Parma are chilling. They are not the diaries of a teenager. They are the treatises of a nihilist. She wrote that death was not something to fear. She wrote that the dead were the lucky ones. They were done with the charade. "I know that I shall die young," she wrote to a friend. "I feel it in my blood." This was not teenage drama. This was a conviction. She viewed her body as a temporary, decaying vessel. She viewed her future as a meaningless obligation. She was already checking out of life before she had even really started living it. Meanwhile, in Vienna, a very different drama was unfolding. Empress Maria Theresa was playing 4D chess with Europe. She was the most powerful woman on the continent. She had fought wars to keep her throne. She had 16 children, and she loved them, but she also used them. They were her currency. She needed to secure the succession. Her eldest son, Joseph, was the heir. The pressure on him was immense. He was being raised to rule an empire that contained a dozen different languages and cultures. Joseph was a difficult project. He was smart, sharper than his father, but he was rigid. He had no charm. He had no small talk. He was intense, serious, and socially awkward. He terrified people with his staring eyes and his blunt questions. Maria Theresa worried about him. She knew he needed a wife who could soften him, a wife who could handle him, a wife who was intelligent enough to challenge him, but submissive enough to obey him. She looked at the map of Europe. She saw Parma. She saw Isabella. The reports came back to Vienna. Isabella was beautiful. She was educated. She was a Bourbon. It was a perfect match. The alliance would bring Austria and the Bourbons closer together, healing old wounds from the War of Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa didn't care about Isabella's melancholy. In fact, she probably saw it as a plus. A serious, quiet girl would be better for Joseph than a flighty, party-loving princess. The contract was signed, the deal was done, Isabella was sold. When Isabella was told she was to marry the future Emperor of Austria, she didn't celebrate. She resigned herself. It was just another step toward the grave. She packed her books. She packed her violin. She said goodbye to Parma without a tear. She got into the carriage that would take her north, over the Alps, to a country she didn't know, to marry a man she had never met. She treated the journey like a funeral procession. Joseph, on the other hand, was ecstatic. He had seen her portrait. He had fallen in love with the painted image of the sad, dark-eyed girl. He built up a fantasy in his head. He imagined that he would be her savior. He imagined that he would bring a smile to that solemn face. He prepared for her arrival with a manic energy. He reorganized his apartments. He picked out gifts. He paced the halls of the Habsburg, waiting. He was a man starving for connection, and he decided that Isabella was going to be the feast. The meeting took place in 1760. The carriage pulled into the courtyard. The drums beat. The trumpets sounded. Isabella stepped out. She was 19. She was pale from the journey, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes huge and unreadable. Joseph stepped forward. He was trembling. He took her hand. He looked into her face, and he was gone. He was lost. He fell into a deep, immediate, and terrifying kind of love. It was the kind of love that ignores reality. He didn't see a depressed, reluctant girl. He saw an angel. Isabella looked at him. She saw a man with intense blue eyes and a nervous, jerky manner. She saw a boy trying too hard to be a man. She felt nothing, no spark, no interest, just a cold, heavy sense of duty. She curtsied. She smiled the smile she had practiced in the mirror. She said the words she had memorized. "I am at your disposal, Your Highness." It was a lie. She was at no one's disposal but death's. But the performance had begun. The wedding was magnificent. Vienna threw a party that lasted for days. There were operas, balls, feasts, and fireworks. The wine flowed like water in the streets. The people cheered for the young couple. They looked perfect together. The dark, mysterious beauty and the blonde, serious prince. But the wedding night was a disaster. Details are scarce, as they always are, with royal consummations. But we can infer the truth from later letters. Joseph was eager, clumsy, and overwhelming. Isabella was passive, cold, and mentally absent. She endured it. She stared at the canopy of the bed and waited for him to finish. She learned that night that her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the state. It belonged to Joseph. The first few months of the marriage set the pattern. Joseph was the puppy dog. He followed her everywhere. He canceled meetings to be with her. He sat by her side while she played music. He brought her jewels she didn't want and dresses she didn't care about. He asked her constantly, "Are you happy? Do you love me?" It was exhausting. Isabella was an introvert being hunted by an extrovert's obsession. She had no space to breathe. She needed an escape. She needed someone who understood the language of silence and art, not someone who barked questions at her. She found that person in the family circle, Maria Christina, Mimi. Mimi was the same age as Isabella. She was beautiful, but in a different way. She was vibrant. She was talented. She was an artist who painted with skill. She was the golden child of the family. The only one Maria Theresa allowed to call her by a nickname. Mimi was clever. She knew how to survive the court. She knew how to manipulate her mother. She saw Isabella struggling. She saw the new sister-in-law drowning under Joseph's suffocating love. Mimi reached out. At first it was just friendship. They walked together in the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace. They played music together. They spoke in French, shutting out the German-speaking court around them. They complained about the stifling etiquette. Isabella found in Mimi a kindred spirit, someone who was intelligent, someone who was sensitive, someone who actually listened to her instead of projecting fantasies onto her. But the chemistry shifted. The walks became longer. The conversations became deeper. They started touching, a hand on the arm, a head on the shoulder, long glances across the dinner table. In the emotionally starved environment of the palace, this connection sparked into a fire. Isabella, who felt nothing for her husband, suddenly felt everything for his sister. The floodgates opened. The melancholy girl who wanted to die suddenly found a reason to live, and that reason was forbidden. Isabella began to pursue Mimi. It is crucial to understand this dynamic. History often paints women as passive in these situations, but Isabella was the aggressor. She was the one who initiated the intensity. She was starving for emotional release. She poured all her suppressed passion, all her intellect, all her frustration into this relationship. She wrote the first letter. She slipped it into Mimi's hand during a dull court ceremony. Mimi read it. She didn't recoil. She didn't run to her mother. She wrote back. The affair began in the shadows of the most scrutinized building in Europe. They had to be careful. Servants were everywhere. Spies were everywhere. Maria Theresa had a network of informants who reported on everything, from what the archdukes ate for breakfast to who they spoke to in the hallways. Yet, Isabella and Mimi managed to build a secret world. They used the guise of sisterly affection. In the 18th century, female friendship was often expressed in flowery romantic terms. Holding hands, kissing on the cheek, sharing a bed, these were considered normal behaviors for close female relatives. Isabella and Mimi used this camouflage to hide a romance that was anything but innocent. Isabella's letters from this early period are frantic. She writes, "I am writing to you again, cruel sister. Though I have only just left you, I cannot bear the silence." She writes, "My heart is yours. It beats only for you." She writes about the madness that takes her when she sees Mimi talking to others. This is the language of obsession. Isabella was transferring her fixation on death to a fixation on Mimi. It was a transfer of addiction. Joseph remained oblivious. He was happy that his wife had a friend. He even encouraged it. "Go, spend time with Mimi," he would say, thinking he was being a benevolent husband. He would watch them walk away together, arm in arm, and smile. He had no idea that as soon as they were out of earshot, they were whispering things that would shatter his heart. He was facilitating his own cuckolding, but the pressure was mounting. Isabella knew her duty. She had to produce an heir. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a failure. The court watched her waistline. The ambassadors wrote reports on her health. Joseph was diligent in his duties, visiting her bed with a mechanical regularity that Isabella loathed. She wrote to Mimi about her dread of the nights. She described Joseph's affection as a burden she had to carry. "I must submit," she wrote. "I must play the part." Then she got pregnant. The news was greeted with cannons and bells. Joseph was over the moon. He treated her like a porcelain doll. He wouldn't let her walk too fast. He wouldn't let her open a window. He smothered her with care. Isabella felt trapped. Her body was swelling, changing, becoming a public property. And the pregnancy made her depression worse. The hormones, the fear of childbirth, which was often fatal, the sense of impending doom, it all crashed down on her. She wrote to Mimi more frequently. "I hope I die in childbirth," she confessed. "It would be a clean end." She wasn't being dramatic. She was looking at the statistics. Death in childbirth was common. For Isabella, it was a gamble she was willing to take. If she lived, she was trapped. If she died, she was free. This was the state of affairs as the year 1761 approached. A pregnant, suicidal wife, a blind, obsessed husband, and a manipulative, complicit sister-in-law. The triangle was set. The tragedy was in motion, and the letters kept piling up in the writing desk, a ticking time bomb, waiting for the day the lock would turn. The ink on the letters was barely dry before they were sent. That is how frantic the correspondence became between Isabella and Maria Cristina during the early 1760s. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we have to look at the logistics. They lived in the same palace complex. They saw each other almost every day at meals, mass, and court functions. Yet, Isabella felt compelled to write to Mimi constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. This wasn't just communication, it was a compulsion. It was the behavior of an addict who needed a fix. The letters were smuggled by trusted servants, a dangerous game in itself. If a maid had dropped a letter, or if a valet had been bribed by a spy, the game would have been over. The contents of these specific letters demolished the idea of a romantic friendship. Historians often try to sanitize the past, claiming that women just spoke differently back then. They argue that "I love you" meant something platonic. But Isabella's letters leave no room for ambiguity. She wrote about her physical body. She wrote about the cruel destiny that kept them apart at night. In one particularly striking letter she wrote to Mimi while sitting on the toilet, she explicitly mentioned this fact. It was crude, earthy, and intimate. "You do not write to a platonic friend about your bathroom habits in the middle of a declaration of love." This was an attempt to strip away the royal facade. Isabella was saying, "I am not a princess here. I am a human animal, and I want you." Mimi's role in this is harder to pin down because her letters were destroyed. We only have Isabella's side of the conversation, but we can infer Mimi's behavior from Isabella's reactions. Isabella is always the one begging. She is always the one apologizing for loving too much. She writes, "I am told that I love you too wildly. Is it a sin to worship an angel?" This suggests that Mimi was setting boundaries. Mimi was likely the one saying, quote, "Calm down, be careful, people are watching." Mimi was the cool head. Isabella was the fire. This dynamic is classic in toxic relationships. The person who cares less holds all the power. Mimi held all the power. While this secret drama played out, the public drama of the pregnancy continued. Joseph was becoming unbearable. His anxiety about the baby manifested as control. He monitored Isabella's diet. He forbade her from engaging in strenuous activities, which included walking too fast or playing the violin with too much vigor. He suffocated her. He thought he was protecting his heir. Isabella felt like livestock being fattened for market. She withdrew further into herself. She stopped talking at dinner. She spent hours staring out the window. Joseph interpreted this silence as maternal contemplation. He told his mother, Maria Theresa, that Isabella was becoming a serious, pious woman. He was completely misreading the symptoms of severe prenatal depression. The birth happened on March 20th, 1762. In the 18th century, A royal birth was not a private medical event. It was a state function. Witnesses were required to ensure no baby swapping occurred. Isabella had to labor in a room full of people. The pain was excruciating. There were no anesthetics, just prayer and endurance. She screamed. She bled. She did what was required of her. She produced a child. It was a girl. They named her Maria Theresa, after the empress. The court was relieved, though they would have preferred a boy. Joseph was ecstatic. He held the baby with a tenderness that surprised everyone. He was a father. He had a family. He thought this was the turning point. He thought the baby would fix everything. He thought Isabella would look at the child and finally find the happiness that eluded her. He was wrong. Isabella looked at her daughter and felt fear. She didn't feel the instant magical bond that poets wrote about. She felt a heavy, crushing responsibility. She loved the child, yes, but her love was dark. She looked at the baby and saw another victim. She saw another life destined for suffering. She wrote to a friend, "I have brought a being into the world to suffer as I have suffered." This is not the joy of a new mother. This is the nihilism of a woman who believes existence itself is a curse. Postpartum depression likely hit her hard. In the weeks after the birth, Isabella struggled to get out of bed. The doctors prescribed rest and tonics. They didn't have a word for depression. They called it melancholy or vapors. They blamed her uterus. They blamed the weather. They never suspected that the root cause was a fundamental hatred of her own life and a desperate, unfulfilled need for a woman she couldn't have. Joseph tried to cheer her up. He planned parties. He bought her more jewelry. He tried to be affectionate, but his affection was physical, and physical touch was the last thing Isabella wanted. Every time he touched her, she recoiled internally. She wrote to Mimi about the disgust she felt performing her marital duties. She described it as a violation, but she couldn't say no. She was the property of the Habsburgs. Her body was a factory for heirs, and the factory had to keep running. The pressure to produce a male heir started almost immediately after the daughter was born. "A girl is nice," the court whispered, "but a boy is necessary." Isabella hadn't even recovered from the trauma of the first birth before she was expected to get pregnant again. The cycle was relentless. Joseph was eager. He wanted a son. He wanted to secure the dynasty. He was back in her bed, enthusiastic and clumsy, blind to the fact that his wife was dissociating during the act. During this period, Isabella's obsession with death moved from a philosophical concept to a concrete plan. She began to predict her own end with eerie accuracy. She told everyone who would listen that she would not live to see her children grow up. She wasn't seeking pity. She was stating a fact. She began to give away her possessions. She organized her papers. It was a slow-motion suicide. She didn't have a weapon, so she used her mind. She willed her body to shut down. Her relationship with Mimi became even more volatile. Perhaps Mimi was getting tired of the constant drama. Perhaps Mimi was getting scared. The empress was starting to ask questions. Maria Theresa was no fool. She noticed the looks. She noticed the whispers. She lectured Mimi on propriety. She warned her daughters about excessive intimacy. Mimi, who valued her position and her comfort above all else, likely tried to pull back. This terrified Isabella. The thought of losing Mimi was worse than death. It was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Her letters became more desperate. She accused Mimi of coldness. She accused her of abandonment. "If you leave me," she wrote, "I shall have nothing." It was emotional blackmail. Isabella was using her own fragility as a weapon to keep Mimi close. It was a manipulation born of panic. Then came the miscarriages. Isabella got pregnant again quickly, but her body was weak. The stress was too high. She lost the baby. It was a boy. The court mourned. Joseph was crushed. Isabella was numb. But the machine didn't stop. She got pregnant again. Another miscarriage. The physical toll was horrific. Hemorrhages, infections, recovery, and then back to the marital bed to try again. By 1763, Isabella was a shadow. She was thin, pale, and constantly sick. Her immune system was shot. She looked like a ghost walking the halls of the Habsburg. Yet Joseph still didn't see the danger. He saw her frailty as ethereal beauty. He thought she needed fresh air and good food. He didn't realize she was dying of despair. It was in this weakened state that she became pregnant for the 4th time. This pregnancy felt different. It felt fatal. Isabella told Mimi, "This is the one that will kill me." She said it with a sense of relief. She wrote a letter that sounded like a will. She entrusted her daughter, little Maria Theresa, to Mimi's care. She wrote, "Be a mother to her, for I shall not be there." She was clearing the decks. She was ready to go. The tragedy here is Joseph's absolute blindness. He was an intelligent man. He could discuss economics, law, and military strategy. But he could not read the woman sleeping next to him. He was a victim of his own ego. He needed her to be the perfect wife so badly that he hallucinated a reality where she was happy. He ignored the red flags because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging his own failure. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't make her happy. He didn't want to admit that his love wasn't enough to cure her. And where was Maria Theresa, the empress? She was watching. She was worried. But she was also a pragmatist. As long as Isabella was pregnant, she was useful. The empress sent doctors. She sent priests. She ordered prayers said in the churches. But she didn't intervene in the marriage. She didn't separate them. She needed a grandson. The biological imperative of the dynasty outweighed the mental health of one Italian princess. As the winter of 1763 approached, Vienna grew cold. The wind howled through the palace courtyards. Smallpox rumors started to circulate in the city. It was the invisible enemy. It struck rich and poor alike. There was no vaccine, only a primitive form of inoculation that was dangerous and controversial. The royal family had not been inoculated. They were vulnerable. Isabella spent her days in her rooms playing with her daughter and writing to Mimi. The tone of the letter shifted. The frantic passion gave way to a sad, resigned tenderness. She was saying goodbye. She knew something was coming. She wrote about the peace of the grave. She wrote about how the noise of the world would finally stop. She was 21 years old, writing like an 80-year-old woman at the end of a hard life. One evening, Isabella complained of a headache and a fever. Joseph dismissed it as a chill, but the fever spiked. She began to shiver uncontrollably. She felt a deep, aching pain in her back. These were the classic prodromal symptoms of smallpox. The virus was already in her blood, replicating, preparing to launch its assault on her skin and organs. When the first spots appeared, the panic in the palace was absolute. Smallpox was a death sentence for many and a disfiguring curse for survivors. Joseph was told to stay away. He was the heir. He couldn't risk infection. But for the first time in his life, Joseph disobeyed protocol. He disobeyed his mother. He stormed past the guards and went into Isabella's room. This moment is crucial. It shows the depth of Joseph's love, however misguided it was. He was willing to die for her. He sat by her bed. He saw the red spots turning into blisters. He smelled the sickening odor of the disease. He didn't flinch. He held her hand. He talked to her. He tried to anchor her to the world with the sheer force of his will. But Isabella wasn't looking at him. In her delirium, she called out names. She mumbled in French. Did she call out for Mimi? It is very likely. Did Joseph hear it? If he did, he suppressed it. He told himself it was just the fever talking. He was still protecting his illusion, even as his wife lay dying. The labor pains started prematurely. The virus had triggered the birth. The doctors were terrified. A birth in the middle of a smallpox infection was a medical nightmare. They had to get the baby out. Isabella was too weak to push. The scene in that bedroom was a scene of horror. Blood, pus, sweat, and the screams of a dying woman. The baby was born, another girl. They named her Christina, perhaps at Isabella's dying request, or perhaps in a cruel twist of irony honoring the sister-in-law. The baby lived only a few hours. She died before she could even be properly held. Isabella barely registered the death. She was drifting further away. The smallpox pustules became confluent, merging into large sheets of infection. Her skin, once praised for its pallor, turned black and purple. She was bleeding internally. This was hemorrhagic smallpox, the most lethal form. There was no hope. The priests came to administer the last rites. They anointed her forehead with oil, touching the sores. Joseph refused to leave. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He watched the light fade from her eyes. He begged her to stay. "Don't leave me," he sobbed. "I cannot do this without you." Isabella looked at him, but did she see him? Or did she see the freedom she had craved since she was a child? Did she see the end of the performance? Her last words are not recorded as a grand speech. She simply faded. On November 27th, 1763, the struggle ended. Isabella of Parma was dead. She had gotten her wish. The silence that followed was heavy. The doctors stepped back. The priests murmured prayers. Joseph collapsed. His grief was violent. He had to be dragged from the room. He was a man possessed by pain. He felt that God had punished him. He felt that he had failed. But the true punishment was waiting in the writing desk. The key was in his pocket. The letters were in the drawer. The timeline of discovery is imminent. Joseph is about to transition from the grieving widower to the betrayed husband. The ghost of Isabella was about to speak the truth for the first time, and it would be a truth that tasted of iron and bile. As the servants prepared Isabella's body for burial, washing the ravaged skin and dressing her in silk, Mimi was in her own rooms. Was she crying? Was she burning her own letters? Was she preparing her defense? Mimi was a survivor. She knew the storm was coming. She knew that when Joseph found those papers, the dynamic of the family would shatter. She had lost her lover, but she had to make sure she didn't lose her position. This concludes the setup of the tragedy. The death has happened. Now comes the aftermath. Now comes the reckoning. The story of Isabella of Parma is not just about her life. It is about the shadow she cast over the Habsburg Empire for the next 30 years. Joseph would never recover. He would rule as a broken man, and his policies, his wars, and his coldness can all be traced back to this bedroom, this death, and these letters. The funeral rites for Isabella of Parma were elaborate, somber, and performed with the rigid precision of the Habsburg court. While the priests chanted in Latin and the court donned black velvet, Joseph was a man operating on autopilot. He moved through the ceremonies like a sleepwalker. His grief was so visible, so raw, that even the stiffest ambassadors wrote home about it. They described a man destroyed, but the true destruction had not yet happened. That was waiting for him in the quiet of his private apartments, after the incense had cleared and the body was sealed in the crypt. It was customary for the survivor to sort through the deceased's effects. This wasn't just sentimental, it was practical. Jewelry had to be cataloged, debts had to be paid, papers had to be organized. Joseph approached this task with a religious devotion. He wanted to touch everything she had touched. He wanted to read every thought she had written. He believed that by immersing himself in her mind, he he could keep her alive a little longer. He unlocked the writing desk. He expected to find the intellectual musings of the woman he considered a philosopher queen. He found the letters to Mimi. The initial confusion must have been paralyzing. Joseph knew his wife and sister were close. He had seen them whispering. He had seen them walking arm in arm. But he viewed this through the lens of 18th century sentimentality. He thought it was a pure sisterly bond. As he began to read, that lens cracked. The volume of correspondence alone was staggering. Hundreds of pages, notes scribbled on scraps of paper, long, pouring confessions written late at night. The sheer logistical effort required to write and hide this amount of paper was proof of a double life. He started reading. The language was not sisterly, it was not platonic. It was the language of a lover speaking to their beloved. Isabella wrote of her burning impatience to see Mimi. She wrote of her jealousy. She wrote, "I kiss you again and again in my thoughts." She described the physical sensation of missing Mimi as a sickness. It was intense, overheating, and desperate. Joseph sat in the silence of his room, the papers trembling in his hands. He was reading the words of a woman he didn't know. The cold, melancholy wife who barely tolerated his embrace was here, on these pages, a creature of fire and need. But the fire was not for him. Then came the insults. They were not malicious insults, which might have been easier to bear. They were insults of indifference. Isabella wrote about Joseph as one writes about a nagging chore. She complained about his demands. She complained about his presence. She described her marital duties, the very moments Joseph thought were acts of love, as sacrifices she had to make. She wrote about steeling herself to endure him. She wrote about disassociating while he held her. This was the kill shot. Joseph had built his entire self-worth around the idea that he was making her happy, or at least trying to. He believed they had a spiritual connection. The letters proved that while he was making love to her, she was wishing he was her sister-in-law. It reduced him to nothing. He was not the hero of her story. He was the villain. He was the unwanted intruder in a romance between his wife and his sister. The psychological impact of this discovery on a man like Joseph cannot be overstated. He was a Habsburg. He was raised to believe he was the center of the universe. To find out that he was merely an annoyance to the two women closest to him was a humiliation that cut to the bone. And it raised a terrifying question. Did Mimi feel the same way? Was his sister laughing at him too? Was she reading these letters and mocking his clumsiness, his eagerness, his blindness? Joseph did not burn the letters immediately. A more impulsive man might have. A more protective man might have destroyed the evidence to save his wife's reputation. Joseph kept them. He obsessively organized them. He copied some of them. This behavior suggests a man trying to solve a crime. He was building a case against his own happiness. He wanted to understand the full extent of the lie. He read them over and over, memorizing the phrases that hurt him the most. He was pressing on the bruise again and again. He took the evidence to his mother. This was the only move he could make. Maria Theresa was the ultimate authority. She was the head of the family and the state. Joseph walked into her chambers, likely pale and shaking, and placed the bundle of letters on her desk. "Read this," he likely said. "Read what they did." Maria Theresa was a pragmatist. She had ruled an empire through wars and famine. She was not easily shocked. But this must have shaken her. This was not just a scandal. It was a perversion of the family order. Her daughter-in-law and her favorite daughter. It threatened the moral authority of the dynasty. The Catholic Church, the foundation of their power, viewed sodomy and homosexual acts as mortal sins. If this leaked to the courts of Prussia or France, the House of Austria would be a laughingstock. The empress went into damage control mode immediately. Her reaction was not to comfort Joseph, but to contain the fire. She confiscated the letters. She likely ordered a complete sweep of Mimi's apartments to ensure no reciprocal letters from Isabella survived. This explains why we only have one side of the conversation today. Mimi's letters to Isabella were destroyed. Maria Theresa erased the evidence of her daughter's complicity. She sterilized the history. Then came the confrontation with Mimi. We do not have a transcript of this meeting, but we can infer its tone. Maria Theresa was a formidable mother. She demanded absolute obedience. Mimi would have been summoned. She would have been shown the letters. There would have been no denial possible. The handwriting was Isabella's, but the recipient was clearly Mimi. Mimi was the favorite, but she had crossed a line. However, Maria Theresa also knew that punishing Mimi publicly would expose the scandal. So the punishment was silence. Mimi was reprimanded, likely severely, in private. She was told to never speak of this again. She was told to play the role of the grieving sister-in-law. And Mimi, who was a master of survival, obeyed. She buried her feelings. She buried the truth. She looked her brother in the eye and likely lied, claiming she had tried to discourage Isabella, claiming it was just the ramblings of a sick woman. She gaslit him to save herself. Joseph didn't buy it. His relationship with Mimi was permanently damaged. He never trusted her again. He remained civil. They were royalty after all, and civility was a weapon. But the warmth was gone. He saw her for what she was, a player in the game who had played him for a fool. But the biggest change happened inside Joseph. The death of Isabella and the discovery of the letters killed the romantic idealist in him. Before this, he believed in the goodness of people. He believed in love. After this, he believed in systems. He believed in rules. He believed that human emotions were messy, unreliable, and treacherous. He began to view the world through a lens of cynicism. If the wife he worshipped could lie to his face every day for 3 years, who could be trusted? No one. If his own sister could betray him, what would his ministers do? What would his generals do? He decided that he would rely only on himself. He would become the first servant of the state. He would work 18 hours a day. He would check every ledger. He would read every report. He would micromanage the empire because he could not trust anyone else to do it right. The title of iron began to form. Joseph became hard. He became ruthless. When his mother urged him to remarry to produce a male heir, he refused to engage emotionally. He agreed to the marriage with Josepha of Bavaria, but he treated it like a business transaction. He didn't even pretend to like her. He refused to sleep with her. He refused to talk to her. He walled off his heart completely. He was punishing the new wife for the sins of the old one. He was punishing the entire female sex for the betrayal of Isabella. The court noticed the change. They whispered that the emperor had turned to ice. They didn't know about the letters. They thought he was grieving too hard. They thought he was loyal to Isabella's memory. The irony was bitter. He wasn't loyal to her memory. He was held hostage by it. He was obsessed with the phantom of the woman who had deceived him. He kept a portrait of Isabella in his room for the rest of his life. Why? Was it love? Or was it a reminder? A reminder of the folly of trust. A reminder of the pain of vulnerability. He looked at that face every day, the dark eyes, the slight smile, and he saw the lie. It fueled his drive. It fueled his frantic need to reform Austria, to fix the world, to impose order on chaos. Because he couldn't control Isabella, he would control the empire. The letters also reveal a darker side of Isabella's psychology that Joseph was forced to confront. It wasn't just that she loved Mimi, it was that she loved death. In the letters, her desire for Mimi and her desire for death are often intertwined. She writes about them with the same passionate intensity. She romanticized the end. Joseph realized that he had been fighting a battle he could never win. He was fighting against a death wish. All his gifts, all his doctors, all his prayers, they were useless against a woman who looked at the grave as a lover. This realization absolved him of guilt, perhaps, but it filled him with anger. She had used him. She had used his body to make children she didn't want to live to see. She had used his position to stay close to his sister. She was a parasite on his life. This is a harsh judgment, but it is the judgment of a man in pain. Joseph felt exploited. The scandal was contained, but the cracks in the foundation remained. The relationship between Joseph and Maria Theresa became strained. He resented her for protecting Mimi. He resented her for orchestrating the marriage in the first place. He began to challenge her authority more aggressively. The co-regency between mother and son became a battleground. Joseph pushed for radical reforms. He wanted to tear down the old structures. Maria Theresa wanted to preserve them. This political conflict was fueled by the personal animosity simmering under the surface. In the years that followed, Joseph would often visit the crypt where Isabella lay. He would stand before her coffin. What did he say? Did he yell at her? Did he weep? Or did he just stand there in silence, a man arguing with a ghost? We don't know, but we know that he never let her go. He carried the trauma of that discovery until his own death. The story of Isabella and Mimi is often told as a tragic romance, a forbidden love crushed by a homophobic society. And it is that. But from Joseph's perspective, it was a horror story. It was a psychological thriller where the victim realizes the call is coming from inside the house. It was the moment he learned that the person sleeping next to you can be a total stranger. As 1764 dawned, Joseph was a changed man. The boy was dead. The tyrant was waking up. And the letters confiscated and hidden away in the archives sat in the dark, waiting for historians to find them centuries later. They waited to tell the world that the great emperor Joseph II was not just a widower. He was a cuckold, betrayed by his own blood and his own heart. While Joseph was drowning in the wreckage of his marriage, Maria Christina, the other woman in the tragedy, was doing what she did best, surviving. History often casts the other woman as a villain or a victim, but Mimi was neither. She was a politician. She was a Habsburg Archduchess who understood the rules of the game better than her brother did. She knew that the letters had been found. She knew her mother, the empress, had read the graphic details of her intimacy with Isabella. A lesser woman would have been crushed by the shame. A lesser woman would have been exiled to a convent. Mimi did not go to a convent. She went to work repairing her image. She played the role of the grieving sister perfectly. She wore black. She wept in public. She spoke of Isabella with a sanitized, holy reverence. She effectively gaslit the entire court. She made them believe that her bond with Isabella was purely spiritual, a meeting of two high-minded souls. She banked on the fact that the empress would never release the letters because the scandal would destroy the monarchy. Mimi used her family's pride as a shield. She knew her mother would protect the dynasty first and the truth second. She was right. Joseph saw through it. He watched his sister perform her grief, and he felt a cold, hard hatred growing in his gut. He knew she was lying. He knew that while he was mourning the loss of a wife, Mimi was mourning the loss of a lover, yet she dared not speak its name. The distance between the siblings became an abyss. They still dined together. They still appeared at state functions together. But the trust was gone. Joseph looked at Mimi and saw a mirror of his own humiliation. She was the living proof that he had been a fool. But the machine of the state did not care about Joseph's feelings. It cared about biology. Joseph was the heir. He had no living children. The daughter Isabella had died birthing was gone. The first daughter, little Maria Theresa, was a frail child. The succession was in danger. The empress gave Joseph a few months to mourn, and then she dropped the hammer. He had to remarry. Joseph refused. He told his mother he would never marry again. He told her his heart was buried in the crypt with Isabella. He was dramatic, obstinate, and genuinely traumatized. He couldn't imagine touching another woman. The very idea of intimacy made him sick. He had associated sex with betrayal. But Maria Theresa was relentless. She brought in priests to lecture him on his duty to God. She brought in advisors to lecture him on his duty to the state. She wore him down. Finally, he cracked. He agreed to remarry, but he set a condition. He didn't care who it was. He wouldn't choose. He wouldn't court. He told them to just pick a body and put it in his bed. He washed his hands of the decision. This was a fatal mistake. By abdicating his choice, he allowed the diplomats to choose based solely on politics. They chose Josepha of Bavaria. If you wanted to design a candidate guaranteed to make Joseph miserable, you would design Josepha. She was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII, so her pedigree was impeccable. But that was where the positives ended. She was 2 years older than Joseph. She was described by contemporaries as short, stout, and physically unattractive. Her teeth were bad. Her skin was rough. She had none of Isabella's haunting beauty, none of her intellect, none of her musical talent. She was a simple, kind, uncomplicated woman who enjoyed card games and quiet evenings. Joseph was a man who worshipped aesthetic beauty and intellectual sharpness. When he saw Josepha, he was repulsed. He didn't just dislike her, he was physically disgusted by her. He wrote to a friend, describing her as a short, fat figure with pimples and bad teeth. He was cruel. He was vicious. He compared her to Isabella constantly. He looked at Josepha's hands and missed Isabella's elegant fingers. He listened to Josepha's voice and missed Isabella's soft French whispers. He punished Josepha for not being Isabella. The wedding took place in January 1765. It was a funeral with white ribbons. Joseph stood at the altar looking like a man marching to the gallows. He barely looked at his bride. He didn't smile. The court noticed. The ambassadors wrote home that the emperor looked desperate. Josepha, poor woman, was not blind. She saw the look in his eyes. She saw the recoil when she tried to touch his arm. She knew she was walking into a nightmare. She had hoped to be an empress. Instead, she became a punching bag for a grieving man's anger. The marriage was a sham from day one. Joseph partitioned the palace. He created physical barriers between his apartments and hers. He avoided dining with her. When he had to appear in public with her, he was cold and distant. But the worst cruelty happened behind closed doors. Joseph refused to sleep with her. He refused to even try to create an heir. The entire purpose of the marriage, the biological imperative, was stalled because Joseph couldn't bring himself to touch her. He wrote about this too. His letters from this period are hard to read. They show a man who has lost his empathy. He describes his wife as an obstacle and a burden. He jokes about her appearance. He was taking all the pain and humiliation he felt from Isabella's betrayal and projecting it onto this innocent Bavarian princess. Josepha had done nothing wrong. Her only crime was being unappealing and being married to a man who was in love with a ghost. Josepha tried. She tried to be kind to his daughter, Maria Theresa. She tried to engage him in conversation. She tried to be the dutiful wife. Every attempt was met with a wall of ice. Joseph would walk past her in the hallway without acknowledging her presence. He treated her worse than a servant. At least he spoke to the servants. To Josepha, he offered only silence. The ghost of Isabella was the third person in this marriage. Joseph kept Isabella's rooms exactly as she had left them. He spent hours there, sitting among her things, reading her books, playing her music. It was a shrine. He was living with the dead. Imagine the psychological torture for Josepha. She was living in a palace where the dead wife was worshipped and the living wife was shunned. She was competing with a corpse and she was losing. This situation dragged on for 2 years. The pressure on Joseph to consummate the marriage was immense. His mother begged him. His doctors examined him. Joseph simply shrugged. He said he couldn't do it. He said his body wouldn't cooperate. It was a physical manifestation of his psychological block. He had locked his heart, and his body followed suit. Then, history repeated itself with a cruel, ironic twist. Smallpox returned to the Habsburg. In 1767, the disease that had killed Isabella came for Josepha. The panic in the court was immediate, but Joseph's reaction was completely different this time. When Isabella was sick, he had stayed by her side day and night, risking his life, holding her hand, weeping, praying. When Josepha fell sick, Joseph didn't even go into the room. He stayed away. He claimed he couldn't risk infection for the sake of the state. It was a convenient excuse. The truth was he didn't care. He felt no urge to comfort her. He felt no fear of losing her. In fact, deep down in the dark corners of his mind, he might have felt a flicker of hope. If she died, he would be free. If she died, the burden would be lifted. Josepha died alone. Her skin was ravaged by the pox, her body swollen and in pain. She died without a kind word from her husband. She died knowing she was unloved and unwanted. She was 28 years old. Her life in Vienna had been 2 years of humiliation and loneliness. Joseph didn't attend her funeral. He didn't visit her grave. He erased her from his life instantly. He didn't speak of her. He didn't keep her letters. He didn't build a shrine. To him, she was just a mistake that had been corrected by nature. The contrast between the two deaths is the definitive proof of Joseph's transformation. The first death broke his heart. The second death calcified it. With Josepha gone, the pressure started again. "You must marry," the advisor said. "We still need an heir." But this time Joseph slammed the door. "No," he said, and he meant it. He told his mother that he had done his duty. He had married the woman they chose. He had suffered for 2 years. He was done. He would never marry again. He would never put himself in a position to be hurt, controlled, or disappointed by a woman again. He turned his energy entirely to the state. This is the moment the revolutionary emperor was truly born. Since he couldn't have a happy home, he would build a perfect state. Since he couldn't control the chaos of his emotions, he would control the chaos of society. He began to draft laws with a furious speed. He attacked the power of the church. He attacked the nobility. He tried to force enlightenment onto his people whether they wanted it or not. He was ruling with the same intensity he had once used to love Isabella. Mimi, meanwhile, watched all of this. She saw the second wife die. She saw her brother harden into stone, and she played her cards. She knew that Joseph would never produce an heir. That meant the succession might pass to his brothers, or perhaps there was room for her to maneuver. She began to lobby her mother for something unprecedented. She wanted to marry for love. She had fallen in love with Prince Albert of Saxony. He was not a great match. He had no money and little political power. Ordinarily, Maria Theresa would have laughed him out of court. But Mimi used the family tragedy to her advantage. She played on her mother's guilt. She pointed out how miserable Joseph was. She pointed out how the arranged marriage system had produced only death and sorrow. She wore the empress down. In a stunning break with tradition, Maria Theresa allowed Mimi to marry Albert. It was the only love match among her children. Joseph was furious. He looked at this and saw the ultimate injustice. He had done his duty, married a stranger, and suffered. Mimi, the one who had betrayed him, the one who had slept with his wife, was being rewarded with a happy marriage to the man she loved. Joseph refused to attend Mimi's wedding. He stayed in his rooms. He wrote bitter letters about it. He called it a farce. He hated Mimi for her happiness. He hated her for surviving. He hated her for winning. The rift between them was now permanent. They would remain enemies until the day they died, hiding their hatred behind the polite masks of royalty. But there was one final twist in the saga of Isabella's ghost. It wasn't just Joseph who was haunted. The little daughter, Maria Theresa, the only surviving child of Joseph and Isabella, was growing up. She was the apple of Joseph's eye. He poured all his remaining capacity for love into this little girl. She looked like Isabella. She had Isabella's dark eyes. She was the last piece of the woman he had loved. Joseph became a helicopter parent before the term existed. He was terrified of losing her. He watched her health like a hawk. He educated her himself. He played games with her. For a brief few years, the court saw a glimpse of the old Joseph. When he was with his daughter, he smiled. He was soft. He was human. The little Archduchess was the only thing keeping him from turning completely into a machine. But the curse of the Habsburgs was not done with him yet. The tragedy of Isabella of Parma was a multi-generational poison. It had killed the mother, it had destroyed the father, and now it was turning its eyes toward the child. As Joseph approached his 30s, he was a man alone on a pinnacle of power. He was the co-regent of a massive empire, but he went home to an empty palace. He had no wife, he had no lover, he had no friends, only subjects. He had his secrets, the letters in the desk, and he had his daughter. He thought he had paid his price to fate. He thought the worst was over. He was wrong. The final act of the tragedy was yet to come, and it would strike at the only vulnerability he had left. The year 1768 marked a strange interlude in the life of Joseph II. He was a widower twice over. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the co-regent of the Austrian lands. But inside the walls of the Habsburg, he was just a father. This is the only period in his adult life where we see a flicker of genuine warmth. The object of this warmth was his daughter, Archduchess Maria Theresa. She was named after her formidable grandmother, but to Joseph, she was simply the little Archduchess. She was the living, breathing echo of Isabella. The child was uncanny. She had Isabella's dark eyes. She had Isabella's serious expression. She even had Isabella's intelligence. Joseph projected everything he had felt for the mother onto the daughter. It was an intense, suffocating kind of love. He was determined to raise her perfectly. He didn't trust nannies or tutors. He supervised her lessons himself. He played on the floor with her. He took her for walks. For a man who ran an empire with a stopwatch and a calculator, he had infinite patience for a 7-year-old girl. The court watched this with bated breath. They saw it as his redemption. They thought the child would heal him. They hoped that if the little Archduchess grew up healthy and strong, Joseph might soften. He might remember how to trust. He might even consider marrying again one day. The child was the linchpin of the future. She was the only thing standing between Joseph and total misanthropy. But the dynamic was haunted. Joseph wasn't just loving a child. He was loving a ghost. He looked for Isabella in her every gesture. If the child liked music, he saw Isabella's talent. If the child was quiet, he saw Isabella's melancholy. He was reconstructing his dead wife through their daughter. It was a heavy burden for a little girl to carry, though she didn't know it. She just knew that her father adored her with a fierce, protective energy that scared everyone else away. Then came January 1770. The winter was brutal. The palace was drafty and cold. The little Archduchess fell ill. It started with a cough, then a fever. The doctors were summoned immediately. They diagnosed it as pleurisy, an inflammation of the lining of the lungs. It is a painful, suffocating way to die. Every breath is a knife in the chest. Joseph's reaction was immediate panic. He had been here before. He had watched Isabella die. He had watched his second wife die. He had watched his other children die. The trauma response kicked in. He didn't leave her bedside. He stopped ruling. He stopped reading reports. The machinery of the state ground to a halt because the emperor was busy holding a wet cloth to his daughter's forehead. The illness progressed rapidly. The child struggled to breathe. She was in agony. Joseph, the man who could command armies, was powerless. He knelt by the bed praying to a God he was starting to hate. He begged for a trade. "Take me," he likely prayed. "Take my crown, take my life. Just leave her." It was the bargaining stage of grief, but the universe wasn't buying. On January 23rd, 1770, the little Archduchess died. She was 7 years old. The silence that fell over Joseph this time was different. It wasn't the hysterical grief of 1763. It wasn't the cold indifference of 1767. It was a total implosion. The last light in his life had been snuffed out. The last link to Isabella was gone. The only person in the world who loved him unconditionally, who didn't care about his title or his politics, was dead. Joseph wrote to a friend shortly after the death. His words are terrifying in their clarity. "I have ceased to be a father," he wrote. "It is finished. I'm alone." He didn't just mean he was lonely. He meant that his connection to humanity was severed. He felt that he had been targeted by a cosmic cruelty. Why else would everyone he loved be taken from him? Why else would he be left alive, healthy and powerful, but completely empty? The psychological shift was permanent. Joseph decided that personal happiness was a lie. It was a trap. Every time he reached for it, he was punished. So he decided to stop reaching. He decided to kill the part of himself that needed love. He would become a machine. He would become the state. This is the moment the Josephinism era truly begins. Before 1770, Joseph was a reformer with a heart. After 1770, he was a reformer with a scalpel. He looked at his empire and saw it as a broken machine that needed fixing. He didn't care about feelings. He didn't care about tradition. He didn't care about the church. He only cared about efficiency. If a law didn't work, he cut it. If a monastery wasn't productive, he closed it. If a custom was irrational, he banned it. He worked with a demonic energy. He would wake up at 4 a.m. He would work until midnight. He traveled constantly, bouncing around the empire in a carriage, inspecting hospitals, barracks, and schools. He wore a simple military uniform. He ate simple food. He slept on a hard bed. He was punishing himself. He was living like a monk, but his religion was the state. He became intolerant of failure. He yelled at his ministers. He fired incompetent officials. He micromanaged everything. He trusted no one. Why should he? His wife had lied to him. His sister had betrayed him. His daughter had abandoned him by dying. The only thing he could trust was his own mind and his own will. The death of the little Archduchess also solved the succession crisis, but in the worst way possible. Joseph had no heirs. He refused to remarry. That meant the crown would eventually pass to his younger brother, Leopold. Leopold was everything Joseph was not. Leopold was calm. Leopold was pragmatic. And crucially, Leopold was close to Mimi. They were the successful siblings. They had happy marriages. They had children. They looked at Joseph with a mix of pity and fear. They saw him becoming more erratic, more radical, more isolated. They whispered that grief had driven him mad. But Joseph wasn't mad. He was just empty. He was trying to fill the void with work. He passed over 6,000 edicts in his reign. He changed the legal code. He abolished serfdom. He granted religious toleration to Jews and Protestants. These were massive, history-changing reforms, but they were done without warmth. He didn't free the serfs because he loved them. He freed them because serfdom was inefficient and illogical. He didn't grant tolerance because he respected other religions. He did it because religious conflict was a waste of resources. The people didn't love him. They feared him. They called him the sacristan emperor because he interfered in church matters. They didn't understand his haste. They didn't understand that he was a man running away from his own shadow. He was trying to fix the world before he died because he knew death was coming, and he welcomed it. In the background of this political whirlwind, the ghost of Isabella still lingered. Joseph never removed her portrait from his study. He never spoke her name in public, but he never forgot. The letters in the desk were still there. They were the radioactive core of his life. They were the secret that explained everything. Mimi, safe in her marriage to Prince Albert, watched her brother from a distance. She saw what he had become. Did she feel guilty? Did she realize that her affair with Isabella had set off this chain reaction? Probably not. Mimi was a Habsburg survivor. She likely told herself that Joseph was just difficult. She likely rationalized that Isabella was unstable. People are very good at rewriting history to make themselves the hero. Mimi died in 1798, a wealthy, respected woman, leaving behind a famous art collection, the Albertina in Vienna. She got the happy ending. The villain won. Joseph, the hero who tried to love, lost everything. By the late 1770s, Joseph was approaching 40. He looked 50. His hair was thinning. His face was lined. He had a permanent scowl. He was often sick. He had stomach problems, eye problems, lung problems. He ignored them all. He pushed his body as hard as he pushed his ministers. He wanted to burn out. The relationship with his mother, Maria Theresa, became toxic. She was old, conservative, and religious. She was horrified by his radical reforms. She begged him to slow down. She begged him to stop attacking the church. They fought constantly. Their letters are full of anger and recrimination. But even in their fights, there was a strange codependency. She was the only one left who remembered the old Joseph. She was the only one who remembered the boy who had loved Isabella. When Maria Theresa died in 1780, Joseph became the sole ruler. The bumper was gone. There was no one left to restrain him. He unleashed a torrent of reforms that shook the foundations of Europe. He tried to Germanize the empire, forcing everyone to speak one language. He tried to standardize everything. He was trying to impose a perfect, logical order on a chaotic, emotional world. It was a psychological projection of massive proportions. He couldn't order his own heart, so he ordered the empire. But the chaos always pushes back. The people rebelled. The nobles plotted. The Hungarians were furious. The Belgians revolted. Joseph's dream of a rational utopia began to crumble. He was alone, fighting a million battles at once, fueled only by caffeine and bitterness. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, that Joseph once visited a hospital he had built. He saw a man dying of syphilis. The man was in agony, alone, rejected by society. Joseph stood by his bed. He didn't recoil. He looked at the man and said, "I envy you." He envied the man because the man was dying. He envied the man because the man's suffering was physical, visible, and finite. Joseph's suffering was invisible and endless. The shadow of Isabella was long. It stretched from the wedding bed in 1760 to the deathbed of the little Archduchess in 1770, and then across the entire political landscape of Central Europe. Every time Joseph signed a decree with his sharp, angry signature, he was signing a testament to his own brokenness. He was trying to prove that he didn't need love. He was trying to prove that reason was enough. But reason is cold comfort in the middle of the night. Joseph often suffered from insomnia. He would pace the halls of the Habsburg while the city slept. What did he think about in those hours? Did he replay the arguments? Did he replay the moment he found the letters? Did he imagine a different life where Isabella had loved him? Did he imagine a life where Mimi had been a loyal sister? We can only guess, but we know that he never sought comfort in another woman's arms. There were no mistresses, no scandals, no illegitimate children. Joseph II was the most celibate emperor in history. He was married to his job because his first marriage had killed his capacity for intimacy. As we move into the final decade of his life, the tragedy deepens. He starts to realize that his reforms are failing. He starts to realize that people don't want to be fixed. They want to be left alone. He starts to realize that you cannot legislate happiness. And he starts to die. The body he had neglected for years began to fail him in earnest. He contracted tuberculosis, likely during a military campaign. It was a slow, wasting disease. It gave him plenty of time to think, time to reflect, time to look at the portrait of Isabella and wonder if she was waiting for him or if she was waiting for Mimi. The end of Joseph's life is a masterclass in tragedy. It is the story of a man who gave everything and received nothing, a man who tried to be a hero and ended up a villain in the eyes of his own people, and it all goes back to that writing desk. It all goes back to the secret that destroyed his soul. The death of Empress Maria Theresa in November 1780 was the final severance of the cord. For 40 years, she had been the mother of the nation and the mother of Joseph. She was the one who checked his worst impulses. She was the one who smoothed over his rough edges. She was also the one who had covered up the scandal of Isabella and Mimi. With her gone, Joseph was unleashed. He was 40 years old, alone, and absolute ruler of a sprawling, chaotic empire. He didn't take a moment to breathe. He didn't take a moment to mourn. He attacked the job with a manic, terrifying energy. He viewed the empire as a personal project that had been mismanaged for centuries. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to modernize it. But his motivation wasn't benevolence. It was control. He wanted to impose logic on a world that had hurt him with its irrationality. Love is irrational. Grief is irrational. So Joseph declared war on anything that couldn't be measured, counted, or regulated. He issued edicts at a blizzard pace, one a day, sometimes two. He regulated everything from the way priests conducted mass to the way peasants buried their dead. He banned the use of wooden coffins to save timber. He ordered bodies to be buried in linen sacks covered with quicklime to speed up decomposition. It was a rational, scientific decision. It was also a public relations disaster. The people were horrified. They called him a monster who denied them a Christian burial. Joseph didn't understand the outrage. To him, a dead body was just organic matter. He had seen the body of Isabella, the body of Josepha, the body of his daughter. They were just shells. Why waste good wood on them? His lack of emotional intelligence, forged in the trauma of his marriage, was now causing riots in the streets. He attacked the church with a vengeance. He closed hundreds of monasteries. He called them useless. If a monk wasn't teaching or nursing the sick, he was a parasite. Joseph seized their lands and sold them to fund schools. It was arguably a good policy, but the way he did it was brutal. He stripped the altars. He melted down the gold. He treated the ancient institutions of faith with cold contempt. He was the sacristan emperor, moving the furniture of the church around because he had lost his faith in the divine plan long ago. If God couldn't save Isabella, why should Joseph respect God's servants? He tried to erase cultural differences. He tried to make everyone speak German, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Belgians. He told them to forget their heritage and become efficient Austrian citizens. It was arrogance on a massive scale. He thought he could legislate identity. He thought he could strip away the messy emotional parts of culture and leave only the productive parts. He was treating his subjects the way he treated himself, stripping away the emotion to leave only the function. The nobility hated him. He forced them to pay taxes. He banned them from beating their serfs. He opened up the royal parks to the public. He walked among the common people, refusing to bow to etiquette. This sounds democratic, but it wasn't. It was misanthropic. He despised the nobles. He remembered how they gossiped about Isabella. He remembered their fake smiles. He wanted to humiliate them. By elevating the peasants, he was dragging the aristocracy down to his level of unhappiness. But the tragedy of Joseph's reign is that the peasants didn't love him for it. They didn't understand him. They wanted their old customs. They wanted their wooden coffins. They wanted their local languages. They saw him as a tyrant who interfered in their lives. Joseph was baffled. He was giving them freedom, and they were throwing rocks at his carriage. He wrote to his brothers in despair, "I am killing myself for these people," he said, "and they hate me." He didn't realize that you cannot force people to be free. You cannot force them to be happy. Just like he couldn't force Isabella to love him. His isolation became absolute. He ate alone. He worked alone. He slept alone. The ghost of Isabella was always there. It's impossible to disconnect his frenetic political activity from his private void. A man who goes home to a loving family can handle political failure. A man who goes home to an empty room and a stack of paperwork has no buffer. The state was his wife. The state was his child, and the state was cheating on him. In 1787, the situation exploded. The Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, rose in revolt. They were tired of his reforms. They were tired of his interference. Then Hungary threatened to rebel. The empire was cracking. Joseph reacted with fury. He sent in troops. He suspended constitutions. He was becoming the very thing he hated, a despot. He was trying to hold on to power with an iron grip because he had lost control of everything else. Then came the war. Catherine the Great of Russia invited Joseph to join her in a war against the Ottoman Empire. It was a foolish war. Austria had nothing to gain. But Joseph went. Why? Maybe he wanted glory. Maybe he wanted a distraction. Or maybe subconsciously, he wanted to die. He rode out at the head of his army in 1788. He wasn't a young man anymore. He was 47, broken down by overwork and stress. The campaign was a disaster. The heat was unbearable. The swamps of the Danube were breeding grounds for disease. The army was poorly supplied. Men died by the thousands from dysentery and malaria. Joseph refused to spare himself. He slept in tents. He rode in the rain. He pushed his body to the limit. It was a slow suicide. He caught tuberculosis. It started as a cough, a persistent hacking cough that kept him awake at night. Then came the fever, the night sweats, the blood on the handkerchief. Joseph knew what it was. He had seen it kill enough people. He didn't panic. He accepted it with a grim satisfaction. Finally, the end was in sight. Finally, he could stop running. He returned to Vienna in late 1789, a dying man. The city was grim. The news from France was terrifying. The French Revolution had begun. His sister, Marie Antoinette, was in mortal danger. The mob was storming the Bastille. The old world was burning down. Joseph watched it from his deathbed. He realized that everything he had tried to build was collapsing. His reforms were being overturned. His provinces were in revolt. His sister was likely going to be executed. It was a symphony of failure. He spent his final months in the Habsburg, surrounded by doctors who couldn't help him. He was in constant pain. He couldn't breathe. But his mind remained sharp. He kept working. He signed papers while coughing up blood. He tried to negotiate peace with the Turks. He tried to pacify the Hungarians. He was fighting to the very last second, not for himself, but for the abstract idea of duty. But in the quiet moments when the secretaries were gone, the memories must have returned. He was dying in the same palace where Isabella had died 27 years earlier. He was dying in the same palace where he had found the letters. The circle was closing. Did he forgive her? Did he forgive Mimi? Or did he carry the bitterness to the grave? There is a poignant story about his final days. He asked for his brother Leopold to come and take over. Leopold refused. He stayed in Florence. He knew Joseph was dying, but he didn't want to be associated with Joseph's unpopularity. He waited for him to die. Joseph was abandoned by everyone. The courtiers were already packing their bags to go to Leopold. The ministers were burning incriminating papers. The emperor lay alone in the vast cold room, listening to the clock tick. He called for his burial instructions. He wanted a simple funeral, no pomp, no waste. He wanted to be buried in his uniform. He was a soldier of the state, and he wanted to be buried like one. He dictated his own epitaph. It is one of the most heartbreaking sentences ever written by a monarch. He didn't want to be remembered as the great or the conqueror. He said, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook." Think about that. Failed in all he undertook. He wasn't just talking about the war or the reforms. He was talking about his life. He failed to be a husband. He failed to be a father. He failed to be a brother. He failed to be loved. The shadow of Isabella hangs over that sentence. If he had succeeded in his marriage, if he had found happiness there, perhaps he wouldn't have judged his political life so harshly. But because his personal foundation was built on a lie, the entire structure felt unstable. He died on February 20th, 1790. He was 48 years old. He looked 80. The moment he died, the reaction was brutal. Vienna didn't mourn, it celebrated. People cheered in the streets. The nobles threw parties. His statutes were torn down. His reforms were repealed within weeks. It was as if he had never existed. The Josephinism he had forced on them vanished like smoke. But Mimi survived. Maria Christina, the architect of his misery, was safe in Brussels and later Vienna. She lived for another 8 years. She kept her art. She kept her money. She kept her secrets. She never published the letters from Isabella. She let her brother take the blame for being a cold tyrant, never revealing that he was actually a man with a shattered heart. The tragedy of Joseph II is not that he was a bad man. He was a brilliant man. He was a visionary. He wanted to end slavery, torture, and ignorance. He was 200 years ahead of his time. But he was a man who had been hollowed out by a toxic love. He had no emotional fuel to sustain his vision. He tried to run an engine on water. Isabella of Parma remains the enigma at the center of this black hole. She was a woman who didn't want to be a wife, didn't want to be a mother, and didn't want to be alive. Her tragedy is that she was born a princess. If she had been a commoner, she might have been a poet or a philosopher living quietly. But the accident of birth put her in the Habsburg. It put her in Joseph's bed. It put her in the history books. Her obsession with death wasn't a pose, it was a fundamental rejection of the role she was forced to play. And her love for Mimi was a rebellion. It was the only thing she chose for herself. It was the only thing that was real. Joseph was collateral damage in her war against existence. The letters, those few that survive or were described, are the only testament to the fire that burned the house down. They are not just love letters, they are evidence of a crime scene. The victim of the crime wasn't Isabella, and it wasn't Mimi. It was Joseph. He was the one who was left behind to clean up the mess. He was the one who had to live with the knowledge. As we look back at this story, we have to strip away the royal titles. This isn't about an emperor and an archduchess. It's about a man who loved a woman who loved his sister. It's about the devastation of unrequited love. It's about the way secrets can rot a family from the inside out. Joseph II conquered lands, fought wars, and changed laws, but he never conquered the ghost in his bedroom. He died a defeated man because he couldn't defeat the memory of a woman who kissed him while thinking of someone else. Joseph II is dead. The tragedy is technically over. But to truly understand the wreckage he left behind, we have to go back to the weapon that killed him. We have to open that writing desk again. The letters between Isabella of Parma and Maria Cristina are not just historical documents. They are the black box recording of a crash. Historians often gloss over them, summarizing them as passionate. That is a weak word. Passionate implies romance. These letters are evidence of a psychological spiral that borders on madness. We need to conduct a forensic analysis of this correspondence. We need to strip away the lace and the powdered wigs and look at the raw human desperation underneath. What exactly did Isabella write that was so devastating it turned a loving husband into a tyrant? First, we have to understand the camouflage. In the 18th century, women lived in a separate sphere. Men ruled the state, the army, and the finances. Women ruled the domestic space. In this world, intense female friendships were not just allowed, they were encouraged. It was called romantic friendship. Women were expected to hold hands, share beds, and write flowery letters to each other. It was considered a sign of a sensitive, noble soul. Society didn't see it as sexual because society didn't believe women had independent sexualities. A woman's sexuality was defined by her relationship to a man. Without a phallus involved, the patriarchy simply didn't register it as sex. Isabella and Mimi exploited this blindness. They hid in plain sight. They could whisper in the corner of a ballroom, and Joseph would think they were discussing dresses or gossip. They could retreat to a bedroom, and the guards would think they were praying. This was their cover. But inside that cover, they built a pressure cooker. The letters reveal that for Isabella, this was not a fun diversion. It was a matter of life and death. Her dependency on Mimi was total. In one letter she writes, "I am writing to you again, cruel sister, though I have only just left you. I cannot bear the waiting to know my fate, and whether you consider me a person worthy of your love, or whether you would like to throw me into the river." Look at the language. Throw me into the river. It is violent. It is melodramatic, but it is sincere. Isabella felt that without Mimi's validation, she deserved to be destroyed. This is the language of a borderline personality structure. She had no solid sense of self. She needed Mimi to mirror her existence back to her. When Mimi was present, Isabella was alive. When Mimi was absent, Isabella ceased to exist. Then there is the physical aspect. The most famous or infamous letter is the toilet letter. Isabella writes, "I am writing this on my chaise percée toilet chair. I kiss your portrait and I imagine it is you." This shatters the illusion of the ethereal princess. It is gross, it is animalistic. It mixes the basest biological function with the highest romantic sentiment. Why write that? Why include that detail? Because she wanted to break down barriers. She wanted intimacy so deep that it included the ugly parts of life. She was saying, I want you to know me completely, even the parts that smell, even the parts that are shameful. For Joseph, reading this must have been a unique kind of torture. He treated Isabella like a porcelain doll. He probably never imagined her using a toilet, let alone writing love letters on one. It humanized her in the worst possible way. It showed him that she was comfortable with Mimi in a way she never was with him. With him, she was stiff, formal, and cold. With Mimi, she was raw and real. The letters also reveal a deep vein of masochism. Isabella frequently refers to herself as unworthy. She calls herself a slave to Mimi's love. She invites Mimi to punish her, to ignore her, to scold her. She writes, "Treat me as you wish, only do not leave me." This dynamic is disturbing. It suggests that Mimi held the whip hand. Mimi was the dominant partner. She controlled the flow of affection. She could turn the tap on and off. Isabella was just the thirsty dog waiting for a drop. We have to ask, why did Mimi keep these letters? This is the million-dollar question. She knew they were dynamite. She knew they were treasonous. Why not burn them after reading? There are two theories. The first is vanity. Mimi was a narcissist. She loved being worshipped. These letters were trophies. They were proof that the most beautiful, intelligent woman in the court, the future empress, was obsessed with her. Keeping them was an ego boost. Every time she felt insecure, she could open the drawer and read about how she was a goddess, an angel, the sun, and the moon. The second theory is insurance. Mimi was smart. She knew courts are dangerous places. Having leverage over the future empress could be useful. If Isabella ever tried to turn on her, Mimi had the receipts. This makes Mimi a much darker character. It suggests she wasn't just a lover, she was an operator. She was collecting collateral. Joseph likely realized this too. When he found the stash, he didn't just see love, he saw manipulation. He saw his wife being played. He saw his sister collecting evidence. This explains his lifelong distrust of Mimi. He knew she was capable of calculating the value of a human heart. The religious context adds another layer of horror to the letters. Isabella was a Catholic. The Habsburgs were the defenders of the faith. Sodomy was a mortal sin. It led to hellfire. Isabella knew this. She mentions God in her letters, but often in a twisted way. She writes that she knows God will punish her. She writes that her love is a demon that possesses her. This is where her death wish intersects with her sexuality. She believed she was damned. She believed her love was a sin that could only be washed away by death. "I am good for nothing but to die," she writes. This wasn't just depression, it was religious guilt. She couldn't stop loving Mimi, so she had to stop living. Suicide was also a sin, but death by natural causes, like smallpox or childbirth, was a loophole. She prayed for the loophole. Joseph, reading this, would have felt a profound spiritual failure. He was supposed to lead her to righteousness. Instead, his marriage had led her to a state of mortal sin. He had failed as a husband and as a Christian patriarch. Let's look at the kissing the portrait imagery again. It appears multiple times. In the 18th century, miniatures, small portraits, were the main way people kept images of loved ones. Isabella was obsessed with Mimi's miniature. She treated it like a fetish object. She likely kept it on her body, perhaps hidden in her bodice against her skin. Imagine the scene. Joseph enters the room. Isabella is sitting there, looking calm. But underneath her dress, the portrait of his sister is pressing against her heart. She is literally branded by her lover. Joseph sits down, takes her hand, talks about the weather. Isabella smiles, but her mind is focused on the hard edge of the frame against her skin. It is a deception so physical, so constant, that it makes the air in the room toxic. The letters also reveal the mechanics of the triangle. Isabella often mentions Joseph. She doesn't call him by name, she calls him the obstacle or he. She writes, "He is coming tonight, I must prepare myself." She treats sex with Joseph as a medical procedure she has to endure. She writes about closing her eyes and dissociating. For a man, reading a detailed description of how his wife mentally escapes while he is making love to her is emasculating. It destroys his sexual confidence forever. Joseph never recovered from this. He likely wondered with every woman he met later, is she really here, or is she thinking of someone else? Is she laughing at me inside her head? This is why he stopped sleeping with women. He couldn't risk the humiliation of being physically present but emotionally invisible. We must also consider the incest factor. Mimi was Joseph's sister. In the eyes of the church, a sister-in-law was within the forbidden degrees of affinity. Sleeping with your sister-in-law was considered a form of incest. It wasn't just adultery, it was a violation of the family blood. It polluted the lineage. Isabella was polluting the Habsburg line, not biologically, but spiritually. Joseph was a man of order. He believed in the sanctity of the family tree. This affair turned his family tree into a tangled, perverse vine. It meant that his daughter, the little Archduchess, was the product of a body that belonged to his sister. It made everything feel unclean. There is a gap in the evidence that is frustrating but telling. We don't have the letters from the final days. The collection stops abruptly. Did Mimi destroy the last ones, or did Isabella stop writing? It is likely that as she lay dying of smallpox, the writing stopped, but the whispering continued. The servants must have known. This is a detail often overlooked. You cannot hide an affair in a palace without the servants knowing. The maids who changed the sheets, the valets who carried the messages, the guards who stood outside the doors. They all knew. They saw the looks. They heard the giggles. They saw the flushed faces. Joseph realized this too. When he found the letters, he realized that he was the last person in Vienna to know. He was the emperor, the all-seeing eye of the state, but he had been blind in his own home. The servants had been laughing at him. The court had been whispering. His authority was a joke. This fueled his paranoia. If the servants knew and said nothing, they were traitors. If the court knew and said nothing, they were enemies. This specific betrayal explains the ruthlessness of his secret police later in life. Joseph created a network of spies that was legendary. He had spies in coffee houses, in theaters, in private salons. He wanted to know everything. He never wanted to be the last to know again. He weaponized information because lack of information had destroyed his life. The letters also show us that Isabella was smarter than Joseph. Her writing is sharp, witty, and philosophical. She references Voltaire and the classics. She runs circles around Joseph's plodding, earnest intellect. She was bored by him. That is a hard truth. He was a bore. He was intense, repetitive, and humorless. Mimi was fun. Mimi was artistic. Mimi was a challenge. Isabella needed intellectual stimulation as much as emotional validation. Joseph gave her lectures. Mimi gave her poetry. Joseph gave her structure. Mimi gave her chaos. Humans are often drawn to chaos when they feel dead inside. Chaos makes you feel something, even if it's pain. Isabella chose the pain of the affair over the numbness of the marriage. So the writing desk contained more than just paper. It contained the blueprint of a tragedy. It showed that the perfect marriage was a sham. It showed that the perfect wife was a suicidal, adulterous, depressive. It showed that the loyal sister was a manipulative opportunist. And it showed that the great emperor was a cuckold and a fool. Joseph locked the desk, but he couldn't lock his mind. The words had burned themselves into his brain. He carried them with him into every meeting, every battle, every lonely dinner. They were the invisible chorus narrating the rest of his life. When he looked at a map of Europe, he didn't just see borders. He saw the chaos of human nature that refused to be ruled. He tried to conquer that chaos with laws, and he failed. The ultimate tragedy of the letters is that they were real. They were the most honest thing Isabella ever produced. Her smiles were fake. Her vows were fake. Her public appearances were fake. But the ink on those pages was the truth. And the truth killed the man who read it. We need to zoom out. We have spent a lot of time in the bedroom and the writing desk, but this story did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the nerve center of the most powerful empire in Europe. The Habsburg Palace wasn't just a home, it was a government building. Every scream, every tear, and every secret whisper had the potential to shift borders. The tragedy of Isabella and Joseph was a personal disaster, but it was also a geopolitical time bomb that nearly blew up the delicate peace of the 18th century. To understand the stakes, you have to look at the map. In the 1750s and 1760s, Europe was exhausted. The 7 Years' War had just ended. It was the first true world war, fought on multiple continents. Austria had survived, but barely. The key to Austria's survival was a shocking new alliance with its old enemy, France. This was the diplomatic revolution. The Habsburgs, Austria, and the Bourbons, France/Spain/Parma, decided to stop killing each other and start marrying each other. Isabella was the physical embodiment of this treaty. She was a Bourbon princess married to a Habsburg heir. She was a human peace treaty. If her marriage failed, the alliance looked weak. If her marriage exploded in a scandalous lesbian affair involving the emperor's sister, the alliance would look like a joke. The courts of Prussia and England, Austria's enemies, would have had a field day. They would have used the scandal to humiliate Maria Theresa and paint the Habsburgs as a degenerate, immoral family unfit to lead the Holy Roman Empire. This explains the terrifying silence of Empress Maria Theresa. When she confiscated those letters, she wasn't just protecting her son's feelings. She was protecting national security. If Frederick the Great of Prussia had gotten his hands on Isabella's letters, he would have published them. He would have weaponized them. Look at the Austrians, he would have said. They can't even control their own wives. How can they control an empire? The ridicule would have weakened Austria's diplomatic standing instantly. Isabella likely knew this. She was educated in politics. She knew that her body was a state asset. By engaging in the affair with Mimi, she wasn't just cheating on her husband, she was sabotaging the state. This adds a layer of recklessness to her character. It suggests that her need for emotional relief was so overwhelming that she didn't care if she burned down the diplomatic revolution. She was willing to risk a European crisis for a kiss. Let's look at the psychology again, but through a modern lens. Today, we would diagnose Isabella with high-functioning depression or smiling depression. This is the most dangerous kind because it is invisible. The sufferer seems fine. They do their job. They smile at parties. They get married. But inside, the engine has stopped working. They are running on fumes. Isabella fits this profile perfectly. She performed her duties. She played the violin. She made conversation. But her letters reveal the internal monologue of a person in severe distress. I am nothing, she writes. I am empty. The contrast between her public performance and her private writing is textbook. High-functioning depressives often seek high-intensity experiences to feel alive. They engage in risky behaviors, gambling, substance abuse, Or in Isabella's case, a forbidden, dangerous love affair. The danger is the point. The adrenaline of almost getting caught is the only thing that cuts through the numbness. We also have to talk about the Habsburg curse. Usually, when people say this, they mean the genetic deformities caused by inbreeding, like the famous Habsburg jaw. But there was another curse, melancholy. A deep, pervasive genetic depression ran through the family lines of both the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. Isabella's grandfather, Philip V of Spain, was manic depressive. He would spend weeks in bed staring at the wall, refusing to speak. Her mother was notoriously unhappy. Isabella inherited this brain chemistry. She didn't have a chance. She was fighting a biological war in her own head before she even arrived in Vienna. Joseph, with his relentless optimism and energy, never understood this. He thought happiness was a choice. He thought if he gave her enough jewels, enough parties, enough love, she would snap out of it. He was trying to cure a chemical imbalance with affection. It never works. The tragedy is that Joseph himself likely had a touch of this family madness, but it manifested differently. In him, it became obsession and workaholism. He couldn't stop moving. He couldn't stop fixing things. If he stopped, the darkness would catch him. So you have a couple where one person, Isabella, runs toward the darkness and the other, Joseph, runs away from it at full speed. They were destined to miss each other. The ripple effects of this story touch the next generation of royalty as well. Look at Marie Antoinette. She was Joseph's youngest sister. She was growing up in the Habsburg while this tragedy was unfolding. She was a child when Isabella died. She saw the gloom that descended on the palace. She saw her brother turn into a stone statue. She saw her mother weeping. Did this affect Marie Antoinette? Absolutely. She grew up in a funeral home. When she was sent to France to marry Louis XVI, she reacted by going in the opposite direction. She partied, she gambled, she bought expensive dresses, she created a world of frivolity and noise to drown out the silence she had grown up with in Vienna. She was running away from the Habsburg melancholy just like Joseph, but she chose pleasure instead of work, and it led her to the guillotine. The ghost of Isabella is also present in the Josephinian reforms regarding the insane asylums. Joseph II was a pioneer in mental health. He built the Narrenturm, Tower of Fools, in Vienna, the first purpose-built mental hospital in the world. Before Joseph, the mentally ill were chained in prisons or hidden in basements. Joseph said, "No, they are sick, they need doctors." Why did he care so much about the mentally ill? Historians talk about his Enlightenment values, but look closer. He had lived with a woman who was mentally ill. He had loved a woman who wanted to die. He had seen the ravages of depression up close. He knew that money and power couldn't cure the mind. Building the Narrenturm was perhaps his way of trying to save the Isabellas of the world. He couldn't save his wife, so he built a hospital to save others. It is a monument to his failure and his hope. We must also consider the what-if scenario. What if Isabella had lived? What if she hadn't died of smallpox in 1763? It likely would have ended in a worse disaster. The affair with Mimi was escalating. The letters were getting riskier. Eventually, they would have been caught publicly. Or Isabella, in a fit of despair, might have committed suicide. A suicide of a future empress would have been catastrophic. The church would have denied her a funeral. The scandal would have been uncontainable. Or perhaps Isabella would have finally broken Joseph's heart while she was still alive. She might have told him to his face, "I don't love you." That confrontation would have been nuclear. Joseph, with his fragile ego, might have snapped. He might have locked her away in a convent. He might have annulled the marriage. In a twisted way, smallpox saved her reputation. Dying young preserved her image as the tragic beauty. It allowed the court to mourn her as a victim of fate rather than a villain of morality. It allowed Joseph to worship a dead saint instead of divorcing a living sinner. Death was the best PR agent Isabella ever had, but for Joseph the what if didn't matter. He was stuck with the what is, and what was a life of service without joy. He became the servant of the state because the position of husband was permanently vacant. He poured his libido into legislation. Every law he passed was a substitute for the life he didn't have. This is why his reign feels so frantic. He knew he was on a clock. He knew that life was short and brutal. Isabella had taught him that. She died at 21. His daughter died at 7. He died at 48. The lesson he learned from Isabella wasn't about love. It was about time. Do it now, he seemed to scream at his ministers. Change everything now, before the smallpox comes, before the darkness comes. The tragic irony is that his haste caused his failure. If he had been more patient, more empathetic, his reforms might have stuck. But he didn't have patience. He had trauma. He ruled like a man running out of a burning building. And in the end, the fire caught him anyway. The political legacy of the Isabella affair is invisible but real. It contributed to the harshness of the Austrian state in the late 18th century. It contributed to the alienation of the emperor from his people, and it contributed to the general atmosphere of doom that hung over the Habsburg monarchy as it entered the 19th century. The empire survived, but it was scarred. It carried the DNA of this tragedy in its bones. When we look at the portraits of Joseph II from his later years, we don't see a tyrant. We see a survivor. We see a man with eyes that have seen too much. He looks tired. He looks like a man who has been carrying a heavy box for 30 years, a box containing a stack of letters he can neither burn nor forget. The tragedy of Isabella isn't just a love story. It is the story of how a single broken heart can shape the destiny of millions. The tragedy of Isabella of Parma was not a solo performance. It was an ensemble piece. While Joseph and Isabella were the leads, there was a supporting cast of enablers, fixers, and silent witnesses who made the disaster possible. We have to look at the people standing in the shadows of the Hofburg, holding the candles while the house burned down. The most important of these was Empress Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa is often remembered as the mother of the nation, a benevolent matronly figure. The truth is sharper. She was a CEO. She ran the Habsburg monarchy like a corporation. Her children were her employees. When Joseph brought her the letters, she didn't just see a heartbroken son, she saw a public relations nightmare. She saw a breach of contract. Isabella had been hired to produce heirs and cement the French alliance. Instead, she had produced a scandal that threatened the moral foundation of the throne. The Empress's reaction was a masterclass in crisis management. She didn't scream. She didn't purge the court. She executed a containment strategy. First, she secured the physical evidence. The letters were taken from Joseph. They were not burned. Habsburgs rarely destroyed documents, just in case they were needed later as leverage, but they were buried in the deepest archives. She effectively put the scandal in a lead-lined box. Then she managed the personnel. Mimi was the problem asset. A weaker ruler might have banished Mimi to a convent in Hungary to rot. But Maria Theresa knew that banishing her favorite daughter would raise questions. Rumors would start. Why is the Archduchess gone? What did she do? So she kept Mimi close. She forced Mimi to act normal. She forced the family to perform the happy tableau even though they all knew the truth. This forced proximity was torture for Joseph, but it saved the brand. The Empress prioritized the brand over the mental health of her children. We also have to consider the role of Count Kaunitz. He was the state chancellor, the architect of the alliance with France. He was the man who brought Isabella to Vienna. Did he know? Kaunitz had spies everywhere. He ran the Black Chamber, the office that intercepted and read foreign mail. It is almost impossible to believe that the head of intelligence didn't know that the future empress was writing love letters to her sister-in-law. If Kaunitz knew, why did he do nothing? Because Isabella was too valuable. As long as she was pregnant, she was useful. Kaunitz likely calculated that a little romantic friendship was a harmless outlet for a bored princess. He underestimated the intensity. He treated human emotions like variables in a diplomatic equation. He thought he could balance the equation. He was wrong. The equation exploded. This is the flaw of the enlightened men of the 18th century. They thought everything could be managed with reason. They forgot that passion is unreasonable. The servants are the other silent chorus. In the Hofburg, privacy was a myth. A princess couldn't dress herself, bathe herself, or use the toilet without a witness. The maids who carried the letters, the valets who guarded the doors, they were the transmission belt of the scandal. They didn't speak to the emperor, but they spoke to each other. They spoke to the washerwomen spoke to the market vendors. By the time Isabella died, the rumor of her strange affection for Mimi was likely open knowledge in the back streets of Vienna. The people didn't know the details. They didn't know about the toilet letter. But they knew something was wrong. They sensed the rot. This contributed to the unpopularity of the court. The people felt that the aristocracy was decadent. They were right. While the peasants were starving, the royals were playing dangerous sexual games in their gilded cages. Then there is Prince Albert of Saxony. He enters the story as the solution to the Mimi problem. After the scandal, Mimi needed a husband. She needed a cover. Albert was perfect. He was poor, politically insignificant, and docile. He was grateful to marry into the Habsburg family. He likely knew about the rumors. He likely knew that his wife's heart belonged to a dead woman. He accepted the bargain. He got the title, the money, and the prestige. In exchange, he accepted a wife who was emotionally unavailable. Albert and Mimi became the power couple of the art world. They collected drawings. They built a palace. They looked perfect. But look at their marriage closely. It was a partnership, not a romance. It was a fortress they built to hide from the past. Mimi used Albert as a shield against her brother's hatred. As long as she was a respectable wife, Joseph couldn't touch her. Albert was the beard that saved her social life. The legacy of this cover-up went deep. The Habsburgs learned a dangerous lesson from the Isabella affair. Silence works. If you ignore a problem hard enough, if you hide the papers deep enough, you can survive. They applied this lesson for the next 150 years. When Crown Prince Rudolph committed suicide at Mayerling in 1889, the family tried to cover it up. When Empress Sisi was assassinated, they tried to manage the narrative. They became a family of secrets. But secrets are like rot in the walls. They weaken the structure. The silence of 1763 set a precedent. It taught the family that appearance matters more than truth. It created a culture of repression. The Habsburgs became famous for their stiff upper lips, their rigid protocol, and their inability to connect with their subjects. That stiffness started here. It started when a mother told her son to stop crying over his wife's betrayal and get back to work. There is also a gendered aspect to the cleanup. Isabella was erased. Her letters were hidden. Her memory was sanitized. She was turned into a generic pious ancestor. The complexity of her life, her depression, her intellect, her queerness was stripped away. History is written by the victors, and the victors here were the patriarchs. They didn't want a story about a woman who rejected the male gaze. They wanted a story about a sad, beautiful mother who died young. They retconned her life to fit the narrative. Joseph's subsequent misogyny wasn't just personal, it became policy. He shut down convents. He excluded women from political influence. He treated his female relatives with suspicion. He had learned that women were dangerous. They could be smart, they could be deceptive, they could hurt you. So he built a government of men. He surrounded himself with bureaucrats in gray coats. He created a boys' club because the girls' club had destroyed him. But the ghost in the machine remained. You can see it in the architecture of Vienna. Joseph opened the Prater Park to the public. He tore down the city walls. He wanted transparency. He wanted a city where nothing could be hidden. He put streetlights on every corner. He numbered the houses. He was obsessed with visibility. Why? Because he had been burned by the invisible. He wanted a world where there were no dark corners for secrets to hide. He was trying to design a city that couldn't lie to him. The enablers eventually died off. Maria Theresa died. Kaunitz died. The servants died. But the trauma remained frozen in the amber of the bureaucracy. The Austrian state became a machine of suspicion. The secret police that Joseph strengthened were the direct descendants of his paranoia. He created a surveillance state because he couldn't trust his own family. If you can't trust your sister, you have to watch everyone. And what about the church? The church knew, the confessors knew. Isabella confessed her sins. The priests heard her despair. They heard her talk about her unnatural love. They did nothing. They told her to pray. They told her to suffer. They viewed her suffering as redemptive. This is the cruelty of 18th century theology. Pain was seen as a ticket to heaven. The priests watched a woman disintegrate and called it piety. Joseph saw this hypocrisy. It fueled his anti-clericalism. He hated the monks, not just because they were lazy, but because they were complicit. They had watched his wife die by inches and offered only empty platitudes. So the tragedy of Isabella of Parma was a systemic failure. It was a failure of the family, a failure of the church, and a failure of the medical system. Everyone failed her. And because they failed her, they created a monster in Joseph II. They created a man who believed that systems were better than people. As we approach the end of this story, we have to recognize that the villains were also victims of the system. Mimi was trapped. Maria Theresa was trapped. Even Joseph was trapped. They were all prisoners of the Habsburg destiny. They were born into a game they couldn't quit. The only person who found a way out was Isabella, and her way out was a coffin. In the final part, we will stand at that coffin one last time. We will look at the ultimate meaning of this dark romance. We will ask what it teaches us about love, power, and the terrifying cost of living a lie. The story ends where it began, with a man looking at a closed door, wondering what is on the other side. The Capuchin crypt in Vienna is a cold place. It is a maze of metal coffins hidden beneath a modest church. The air smells of dust and old incense. Tourists walk through it every day, staring at the elaborate bronze sarcophagi of the Habsburg emperors. They stop at the giant double coffin of Maria Theresa and her husband. They stop at the tomb of Franz Joseph and Sisi, but few people stop at the simple copper coffin tucked away in a corner, bearing the name Isabella of Parma. Even fewer notice the coffin of Joseph II nearby. They lie close in death just as they were distant in life. This is the final resting place of the tragedy. There are no love letters here. There are no secrets, just bones and silence. But if you listen closely to the story we have uncovered, the silence screams. It screams about the cost of living a lie. It screams about the devastation of unrequited love. And it screams about the terrifying power of the human heart to destroy the carefully built structures of the state. As we close the book on Isabella, Joseph, and Mimi, we have to deliver a verdict. History often demands heroes and villains, but this story refuses to give us any. Was Isabella a villain? She deceived her husband. She manipulated her sister-in-law. She wished for death while carrying the heir to the throne. From a dynastic perspective, she was a disaster. She was a saboteur inside the palace. But from a human perspective, she was a hostage. She was sold at age 18 to a man she didn't choose, in a country she didn't know, to breed children she didn't want. Her treason was simply an attempt to feel something other than despair. Her love for Mimi, as twisted and obsessive as it was her only act of autonomy. She wasn't fighting Joseph. She was fighting the erasure of her soul. Was Mimi a villain? She played both sides. She accepted Isabella's love when it suited her and abandoned it when it became dangerous. She prioritized her survival over her sister-in-law's mental health. She was cold, calculating, and opportunistic. But Mimi was also a woman trying to survive in a shark tank. She knew that one wrong move meant exile or ruin. She saw Isabella drowning, and she made the choice not to drown with her. It was a selfish choice, but it was a human one. She chose life. And Joseph, he is the most complex figure of all. He started as a romantic fool blinded by his own projection. He ended as a hardened cynic ruling with a whip. He is often called a tyrant, but he was a tyrant created by pain. Every harsh law he passed was a brick in the wall he built around his heart. He tried to fix the world because he couldn't fix his marriage. He tried to save his subjects because he couldn't save his wife. He is a tragic figure of Shakespearean proportions, a man who gained the whole world but lost his soul in a writing desk. The true villain in this story is not a person, it is the system. It is the 18th century machine of arranged marriages and absolute monarchy. This system treated human beings as biological assets. It ignored compatibility. It ignored mental health. It ignored sexual orientation. It forced a depressive philosopher princess into a bed with an obsessive, high-energy autocrat and expected them to be happy. It was an engineering failure. You cannot build a stable dynasty on a foundation of misery. The letters found in that desk are the cracked foundation. They are the proof that the system didn't work. They are the black box recording of the crash. They tell us that beneath the gold leaf and the velvet, these people were screaming. They were lonely. They were terrified. And they were hurting each other because they didn't know how to stop. What is the legacy of this story today? Why does it matter? 250 years later, it matters because it deconstructs the fairy tale. We are still obsessed with royalty. We watch shows about the crown. We read magazines about princes and princesses. We project our fantasies onto them, just as Joseph projected his fantasy onto Isabella. We imagine that wealth and power bring happiness. Isabella of Parma stands as the ultimate refutation of that lie. She had the best bloodline in Europe. She had the most powerful husband. She lived in the most beautiful palaces, and she wanted to die every single day. It matters because it speaks to the danger of smiling depression. Isabella is the patron saint of everyone who puts on a mask to face the world. She reminds us that the person who seems the most composed, the most talented, the most perfect, might be the one closest to the edge. We need to look past the performance. Joseph failed because he only watched the play. He never went backstage. It matters because it shows the destructive power of secrets. The silence of the Habsburgs didn't save them. It rotted them from the inside. A family that cannot speak the truth is a family that is dying. Joseph carried the weight of that secret for 30 years, and it crushed him. If they had been able to speak, if Isabella could have said, "I am unhappy," if Joseph could have said, "I am hurt," perhaps the history of Europe would have been different. But they couldn't speak. Protocol forbade it. And so the silence won. The final image of this story should not be the funeral. It should be the fire that never happened. Imagine if Joseph had burned the letters. Imagine if he had chosen to erase the pain. He didn't. He kept them. He preserved his own torture. Why? Because it was the only real thing he had left of her. Even though the words hurt him, they were her words. In his own twisted way, keeping the letters was an act of love. It was an acknowledgement that he accepted her truth, even though it destroyed him. Joseph II died believing he was a failure. Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook. History has been kinder to him than he was to himself. We see his reforms as noble. We see his struggle as heroic. But we can never separate the emperor from the widower. The man who tried to enlighten Europe was the same man who sat in the dark, reading the words of a woman who loved his sister. Isabella of Parma burned bright and fast. She was a dark star that crossed the orbit of the Habsburg sun and threw the entire solar system into chaos. She is gone, but the gravity of her sadness still pulls at us. She reminds us that the heart is a lonely hunter, and it often hunts the wrong things. She reminds us that love is not always enough to save a life, and she reminds us that sometimes the most tragic stories are the true ones. As you leave the Capuchin crypt and step back into the bright sunlight of modern Vienna, the noise of the city returns, the trams rattle, the tourists chatter, the coffee houses are full. Life goes on. But down there in the dark, in the copper coffin, Isabella is finally at peace. She has escaped the eyes of the court. She has escaped the demands of the crown. She has escaped the husband she couldn't love. She is finally, eternally alone with her secrets. And perhaps in the silence of the crypt, if you listen very closely, you can hear the faint scratch of a quill on paper, the sound of a woman writing a letter she knows she should burn, to a love she knows will kill her, in a life she knows is already over. If you thought the history of the Habsburgs was just about boring treaties and inbred chins, think again. The story of Isabella and Joseph is a psychological horror movie disguised as a royal romance. It teaches us that power cannot buy intimacy, and that the person sleeping next to you might be 1,000,000 miles away. If you were moved by the tragedy of the Dark Archduchess, or if you think Joseph II deserved better, hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And in the comments, tell me, was Isabella a victim of her time, or was she a selfish manipulator who destroyed a good man? I read every comment, and I want to know your verdict. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the stories the history books try to hide. Until next time, keep questioning the official narrative, because the truth is usually hidden in a locked desk drawer.